Let's get behind the Mortis. I'm John Capers, the producer for Mortis Maledictum.
And I'm Devin McCamey, the author and director. In this show, we're going to give you an exclusive look at the lore, inspiration, and making of our show.
Today we're going to take an inside look at episode 5, Insults and Power.
Absolutely. Let's kick things off with a little tip of the hat.
Yeah, absolutely. So, as some of you may know, our one and only JJ, the narrator, voice of the archivist of Quinn,
and most everyone else at this point.
And up to this point, yeah, basically everybody else he often uses the moniker online, Anubis. So there was a little bit of a tip of the hat to him by including the character Anubis and kind of introducing the idea of these pantheons of gods in this episode, right?
Yeah, we really needed to kind of give him that nod there. It was really good for, the story to have a little bit more basis on these god mythological pantheons, but we couldn't help it. We had to give him a little tip of the hat.
Yeah, well deserved, absolutely. So in discussing those pantheons, in this episode we have the introduction of course, Anubis, as we discussed. You've got Bastet. There's even references to Diana and Jupiter. So what are these pantheons of gods?
So they are based around the mythological pantheons that we know and love, and as well as a whole bunch of other ones. This universe is quite expansive, and it could change up as we add new creatures and things in, like we did the Tuzmek a couple episodes ago. But that was part of the Guardians, not pantheons. They're a little bit different. So the pantheons of gods are tied to their worshippers, which means they can kind of move around, where Guardians are more tied to the land and the space that they're in, and they aren't as mobile, I guess is a good say. So in this particular episode, we've got one pantheon, the Egyptian gods, and another pantheon, the Olympians, and they're kind of having a squabble, and as much as I do like the little tip of the hat to Anubis, I have a soft spot for the Roman gods and the Greek gods, and even though they are copies of each other, well, the culture does mess things up around with that a little bit. So, but that's a soft spot I've got, so I'm always rooting for them.
Sure. And so we talk a little bit about power, right? These gods having power that they draw from the people, right? So worshippers are very important when you're talking about the pantheons of these gods.
Yes, sure. So the power itself is kind of on loan from the worshippers. The worshippers, think of them as like power batteries. They're holding on to the power that they get from the blessings of these gods as they go around and do things. But they also natively generate their own as well. So it's kind of a perpetual motion machine for power, as it were.
So it sounds like power is almost a commodity, right? That's being invested and withdrawn and put into holding. And what else does that mean?
Yeah, 100% is a commodity like that. I mean, and it really comes into play a lot whenever you're talking about different pantheons interacting with each other. And we really haven't had that happen up until this point. This is the first time we've had multiple pantheons in the same kind of chapter or episode where they're having interactions with each other, and they're all talking about power. And it's all about the transfer of power and who's going to take the power from the souls of Cassius and Titus, and why do they want it? Why maybe they don't want it?
Yeah, that's a great point. And I'm sure for our listeners, like, this episode it's not very long, right? It seems like a really quick little one-off, just under 800 words, but it is actually very, very dense with lore and explanation of kind of this world that the Mortis is working in, or the realities that it's working outside of. And so Devin brings up a great point there, talking about why they might not want it. So can you explain why they do or do not want that power?
Sure. So the first scene is about 600 words of Diana coming in and basically enlisting Titus and Cassius to go and do some malicious stuff to Bastet's temple from some slight that had happened. Now, that may be real or imagined. Either way, doesn't matter, because Diana ordered it, and these two are worshippers of that Roman pantheon. Those are their gods. So they said, absolutely, we will do it. We are your guys. And then they go and they trash the place and get in huge trouble with Bastet, of course. And then the next almost 800 words of the second scene there that you were just talking about, those are all about the conversation between the different Egyptian gods talking about power and how they maybe don't want it because they are getting a little strong. Because there is this concept of you always want to be second best. You never want to be the top dog about that. And they kind of allude to it a little bit at the end about the Melusai and the Bastion. And that kind of is the wall, I guess I should say, the ceiling that they don't want to break through and have to run the risk of becoming a Bastion.
Interesting point. So becoming that Bastion is really... it's a dangerous experience. So while they want this power, right, to become more powerful, to have more worshipers, more followers, from a kind of vain standpoint, it seems like, right? They really don't want to be the most powerful because this is a world where the Malice Bastion is a very critical piece of this reality. So, like you mentioned the Melusai, right? And so for everybody... if you're not familiar with this term, the Melusai is the one who holds the Malice Bastion, or the mantle of the Malice Bastion, right? They are the deemed most powerful being in that reality. And then you mentioned the Bastion. We've used that word a few times, right? Which, we know means kind of a place of defense, right? Well, that Melusai, they are the bastion for their reality against the Mortis that exists from without, right?
Yes, and there has been no talk about it so far into the show. So these are different little Easter eggs and different hints and things that have been dropped with the intention of having people be, oh, I don't know what this is. I'm sure this means something, right? And then they'll pick up on it whenever they do the second read-through or listen through the show again or the third time or what have you. And it definitely shows its head in Act 2 for sure, right? Like Season 2, Act 2 it's all about what these things do and how they interact with each other and what that means for the existence of other realities or the defense of the reality that you're currently in or that Quinn's in.
Yeah, so going back to this particular episode, dealing with these two pantheons of gods that are at odds with each other, we've got kind of this dichotomy where they're discussing this transfer of power, right, between their two pantheons and which souls will be taken versus which will be handed over and for very specific purposes, right? It sounds like the Olympians are not interested, even though maybe we're rooting for them a little bit from a historic standpoint. You've got this Egyptian pantheon who are old and powerful, and they, Osiris is kind of leading the charge on this one with this interaction between the pantheons and Anubis the messenger, right?
Right, and it's interesting because they are the old pantheon in this case, and yet at the last bit of the episode it talks about how Anubis becomes the first one from the pantheon that gets to go meet the Melusai. What that means is this whole episode is just chock full of deep lore. I had a blast kind of writing this. So I don't know, maybe people are less lore nerds than I am, but I loved it. But hell, I'm biased. But what that means is essentially they had been quite crafty at avoiding being that top dog that goes and meets the Melusai up until that point. And so the fact that he is the first one that goes and meets them is actually a loss, because then that means he runs the risk of having to carry that Malice Bastion. Because eventually the Mortis, the bad guys on the outside of reality, are gonna win every time, right? And so sure, you get that boost in temporary, but it has a deadline to it. When you eventually do die, your whole pantheon is then hurt because you're gone, right? And so it does give you a boost, but because the gods are looking at things in such long terms, they look at it the long game and they say, it's not worth it. I want to avoid it as best I can. Yeah,
great point. So they kind of create this survivalism, right, for their pantheons. They want to be as powerful as possible. You look at, there was the mention of Amun and Ra kind of merging their power, right, and becoming one god, which is not really something you hear about happening in most of the other pantheons, right? But in this one, they made that deliberate decision to merge their power and become more powerful. But in doing so, they ran the risk of becoming the Malice Bastion, did they not?
They did run that risk a lot. And it actually, in that case for Amun and Ra, whenever they did merge and become Amun-Ra, it helped the fact that Diana and the other Olympians kind of got up to no good because it forced Anubis to take the power so that Bastet wouldn't, because she was really worried about becoming the next Malus Bastion. And you never know whenever the previous Malus Bastion's gonna eat it, right? So you never know when the next wake is gonna get called and the next Malus Bastion will be selected. So you never want to be top dog unless you've got a death wish.
Yeah. Well, that brings up an interesting point as well, because you've got this situation where they're bartering with souls, right? And Diana feels that she is owed some recompense for the destruction of her temple.
Yeah, or at least she's pretending to.
Right. And then at the same time, you've got this sacrifice of Titus and Cassius happening. And I think it's an interesting idea that, maybe something that isn't well discussed in the story itself is the idea that as the followers of these gods, right, they draw power from the number of followers that they have, the souls that have pledged themselves to them, right? And they want to continue to increase that, but like you said, maybe not to become the most powerful because of the Malus Bastion risk, but at the same time, these followers can be kind of guided by the pantheon that they have committed themselves to go to war with one another, can they not? And that can have some serious implications.
Yes, it absolutely can, because if they essentially steal the soul of a competitor, that power then gets transferred to, whoever they were worshiping, right? So the worshiper that is the succeeder, I guess, in any given fight, captures the power of the ones that are losing, or the ones that died, right? Because they died at the hands of your own worshiper. So if an Egyptian, like Anubis specifically, or Bastet, or one of the others, a worshiper of them goes and kills someone that's an Olympian, well, then the Olympian worshiper's power goes to the Egyptian gods, which is why Bastet's so worried about killing them herself, because she'll absolutely just leak it away from the Olympians. So the Olympians are trying to use this as a way of kind of bleeding off some of their power, because they're worried that they're going to get picked next.
So that kind of brings it to the point of this whole thing coming to a head, right? As they're debating how to deal with it, and why it was so critical for Anubis to go and be the messenger and to make some agreeable terms between the two pantheons, because it was necessary, because if this balance of power is thrown too off kilter, or somebody takes too much from the other pantheon, then they run the risk of having to go to war against each other directly, which could be pretty catastrophic, wouldn't it?
It absolutely would, because then you run the risk of one side completely winning, which sounds great and all, until you then say, well, then they're guaranteed the next several Malus Bastions will fall on their heads, and then they'll be diminished in the long term in a huge way. And that's something that, like, the show itself, as it kind of evolves and goes on, we start seeing several different bastions change hands as we go, and we're going to start getting into maybe introducing some of those characters that become these Malus Bastions as we go along. We've already met one. I'm not saying who it is, but we'll figure it out whenever we get there. You've already met one, and it was not in this episode. But as the show goes on, we will definitely kind of uncover more as we go. Actually, I think, as a matter of fact, we've met two. Now that I think about it,
that is indeed true.
That is true. We've met
true. And so, just for reference, this episode was actually set, in the distant past, right? We were talking when these pantheons were in power, thinking from, how it was kind of set in the real world, where their belief systems were stronger and had more followers in that past time, right?
Yeah, that is true, and things have evolved a lot since the other episodes that we've heard so far are a much closer to our time frame, and you don't hear about these pantheons anymore, and nobody worships these gods, and if they do, there's so minimal that it's not anything that's brought up. Like, no one talks about the Egyptian gods in the first episode, Teeth in the Waves. No one's saying, oh, by Anubis, or oh, my Bastet, or anything like that. Nobody's talking about them. Why? Because they're non-existent, which means something has happened in those 3,000 years.
Yes,
that has changed out things.
Absolutely. So this show is listener supported through our Patreon, and as a thank you to our supporters, we just want to remind you that we provide new exclusive episodes of our exclusive storyline, Four Corners, with episodes coming out every month. You've got the script we share to our patrons each month, and then the month following that, you'll hear the fully produced, completed episode of that Four Corners episode following Carver Wallace in his trek, his voyage, his odyssey, perhaps, across, far more than just miles.
Yes, far more than just miles. And some of the monsters that are shown in the episodes are designed by our supporters, such as like Serial Designation O and Heckman have done some so far. Birdie's got one coming up that we owe her, so we're going to talk to her pretty soon about that, get her design for a monster, which is really cool. And we've got Celia, Houdini Bob, and Trina also as supporters that are helping the show kind of get brought to life and continue, and we really appreciate them.
Yes, and so if you would like to be a guest on this show or would like to contribute to the production of the show, or even to create monsters and be a part of the creative process, because we love to involve our community in the direction this show is going, then join our Discord community, because that is where we do our casting from. That's where we communicate with our listeners, and that's where we connect.
Yeah, the link is down in the description. Thanks for getting behind the Mortis with us.
Don't get lost in the dark.